Just the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine about music, and they said, "Jacob, are you a fan of the Grateful Dead? You seem like you might be. Although I'm not a Deadhead, I would say I definitely do like plenty of their stuff. I've listened to loads of their albums, like plenty of their bootlegs. Not the biggest fan in the world, but I definitely like plenty of their stuff. I like Jerry Garcia. I like their style. I like their playing. I like them. However, I do feel like there's a big problem with the band, or at least there's a big problem with like getting into the band. And this conversation with my friend kind of exemplifies it. So he he was just like, well, I was listening to them a little bit on Spotify, and I was listening to like the top few tracks, and I didn't really find anything that kind of grabbed me. I didn't feel like there was really like a catchy song in there, and I kind of went, yeah, that's not really their thing. They don't do like catchy like pop songs in the way that even I don't know, even like Pink Floyd did it a little bit. Like loads of other like classic big name rock bands did it. They don't really do that. It was okay. Yeah, and I hear a lot about how Jerry Garcia is a great guitarist, but I didn't really feel I didn't hear like loads of shredding or like super virtuosic stuff. And I was like, yeah, that's not really their thing either. I wouldn't really say that Jerry Garcia, although I like him as a guitarist, I wouldn't say he's like particularly virtuosic. He's got some decent chops. He does sometimes bring it out a bit more, but he's not super virtuosic. He goes okay. And then my friend's like, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. Wasn't keen on their singing, and I say, yeah. That's not really their thing. That's not really their strong point. I wouldn't say singing is their strong point. Again, I do quite like their voices. Sometimes I don't like their voices that much, but broadly speaking, I like their voices. But it's not really their strong point. And he goes, "Oh, okay." Because I didn't really feel like the lyrics were like that good either. The lyrics were fine in places, but they didn't really stand out. I said, "Yeah, it's not really what they're about." Again, there's some good lyrics in there, some nice lyrics. I think for the most part, the lyrics work. Um, they're very like I guess like demonstrative of a certain like culture and time and place, but they're not the most kind of sophisticated or amazing. They're not Bob Dylan, they're not John Lennon or like Joni Mitchell. They're good lyrics. He goes, oh okay, yeah, fair enough. And another thing, they were quite like low energy. I was listening to all those songs and I didn't really feel like they really like have a super high energy thing about them. And I was like, yeah, that's. I'm sure you can understand what I'm getting at when I say this. It's kind of hard to express or articulate what is so special or even particularly likable about the Grateful Dead. Like they are one of the big names. I think that's fair to say. Even here in the UK, where they're not really like they're not a cultural like icon in the way that they are in America. Like at the end of the day, people who are into music would still put them as like one of the big rock bands of all time. But they're very different from the rest of them, and it's a bit harder to get people into the Grateful Dead than it is virtually any other of those like big rock bands of kind of just their peers in general, people of that kind of like 60s, 70s kind of musical scene. For the reasons I kind of outlined before, right? They don't really write catchy pop songs. They don't really like shred it up in some kind of like super flashy way that would kind of get the kind of idiot teenage boys kind of like, whoa, that's amazing. There's certainly no like Van Halen or even I don't know Richie Blackmore in there. That's not their thing. They're not like super high energy. They're not a party band. They're not the most lyrically sophisticated band in the world. Like none of that is necessary. But you end up thinking like, well, what is their thing? And I can't even argue like they're inaccessible or there's something off-putting about their music, right? Because they're not like noise rock and they're not playing this weird avant-garde kind of noisy. Okay, sometimes they get a bit like that in their live stuff, but it's not really for the most part this spiky, inaccessible, weird, proggy thing that you do get from some 70s bands that, I don't know, it could be Yes or King Crimson, which is kind of, there's an obvious inaccessibility about that, but Grateful Dead don't have that either. It's quite like easy listening, chill stuff. And yet, they're in that like pantheon of rock bands. Um, and I guess the question is, do they deserve it? Do the Grateful Dead, the Jerry Garcia et al., do they deserve that placement in the pantheon alongside Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles? I would say yes, 100%, but for very different reasons compared to every other band in that pantheon because they're just a totally different band. In a way, though, I would say actually to kind of come around to it. In a way, no, they don't deserve to be in, or they shouldn't be in that pantheon. Not because they're not good enough, but because they're just a totally different thing, a different kettle of fish. One might say completely. They're just categorically a totally different thing. Let's get into that in a little bit. Let's just talk generally though. So let's say you're one of these people that I've been a friend of mine I'm talking to, and you're like, I'll listen to a bit of Grateful Dead. You go over, get your mouse, or maybe you're on your phone, and you open your music app. For me, it's YouTube Music, and you type in the Grateful Dead, right? Type this in, Grateful Dead, and then you just let's say you just want to look at what albums they have, right? Immediately, there's a huge problem, right? Because you click on albums. I'm not even going to count how many there are here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 per row, and like I don't know how many rows is that. Could be like 50 rows. There's loads, right? And this isn't even. There's a few bootlegs in here, but it's not really all the bootlegs that the fans have out there. So immediately, we're faced with this huge problem with like, what the hell do you go to listen to first? Because, well, let me just say, tied in what I'm about to immediately say. When I talk to people about the Grateful Dead and say like, oh, I do like them. I think they're a band worth listening to. I don't want to fall into that trap that a lot of fans do, which in a way is reasonable, but I don't want to fall into it because in another way it's completely unreasonable and a little bit crazy to say, oh, you should listen to this specific gig from the 5th of September 1972 in Berlin. Don't listen to the early 1973 April Berlin show that plays like a very similar set. Don't listen. Well, that one's not good. The sound quality. Listen to the original. Oh, yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just it's crazy. It's way, way, way too like obscure, and it just puts people off. You just come across as a lunatic, right? It's just if you're trying to appeal to people, it's just not going to work. So that's all. I don't want to do that. So the difficulty here, right, is that if you're a neophyte, right, and you want to kind of listen to this band, you've been recommended, the Grateful Dead. In fact, even more fundamentally than that, the Grateful Dead. This is the problem I had when I first listened to them. Right, the Grateful Dead. It sounds very metal, and a lot of their kind of art and aesthetics around them is quite like biker metal from an ignorant like 10-year-old English kid, right, back in like the year 2000 or whatever. Maybe I was more like 14 when I first listened to them. And then you listen to the music and it does not fit at all. So immediately there's this like dissonance between what you're hearing as a name, what you associate with the art style, and then what you hear from the music. It just does not match at all, right? And they're not the only band that have this problem, but it is a bit of a problem. Anyway, and then you look at all these albums, right? And there's so many. And maybe you go online and people say, they say, "Oh, don't listen to the debut album." We'll get onto that in a second, right? Don't listen to that; it's just not representative of their sound. And honestly, they'll probably say, "Don't even listen to the next few studio albums because they're really more of a live band. You really want to listen to the live stuff. That's really where they came into their own, right?" Again, it's kind of what I said before. That's such a turn off to people. Don't listen to their studio albums. Only listen to their live stuff. Some people might recommend some of the later '70s studio stuff, but some people might recommend like American Beauty. But even then, if you start listening to it, I guess people are kind of right not to recommend it because it is super low energy. It's not super catchy music. There is a stale sound to it that they don't. It's not a problem they have live. I don't think. Well, I guess they do in a way because again, they're very chill, very low energy most of the time. Oh my god, I feel like I'm dissing them more than I'm kind of bigging them up here. I do like them, I promise. But yeah, the point is, it's hard. It's labyrinthine, this kind of discography, which is just all over the place. Half the fans are telling you not to listen to this, and half the others are just telling you to listen to something super obscure that you'd have to find with great difficulty online on some kind of archive or forum that they maybe have some obscure bootleg. Because everyone has their own like specific favorite bootleg tour or something like. Do you know what I mean? It's a lot. It's hard. Yeah. So how does one get into the Grateful Dead? How does one approach the music, and how do you get into them? Right. Or well, even more simply, right? What do I like about them? So what do I like about them? Right. I feel like when I listen to the Grateful Dead, it's a bit like that Abe Simpson quote for all you Simpsons watchers out there, which I assume is most people, right? Can't remember the exact quote. I'll edit it in, but there's this point about a place that I've never been. I'll edit it in here.
You remind me of a poem I can't remember, and a song that may never have existed, and a place I'm not sure I've ever been to.
And that's how I feel. Like, listen to the Grateful Dead. Their music feels like a place I've never been. Because I'm not American. I wasn't born the right time period anyway to listen to the Grateful Dead or to see Jerry Garcia tour. I'm not part of that like subculture in any way, really. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate it, right? I'm not part of many music subcultures or especially if we're talking about historical ones, right? And I still appreciate that music. But the Grateful Dead do a very good job, better than most, I think, of creating this world and this culture in their music. And I think, firstly, that culture and that world is, this kind of Americana, largely psychedelic, um, kind of pre-rock music world, on the road, bluegrassy, folksy, old-timey. Um, there's a lot wrapped up in there, right? And I think they create that world so well because like they know the music that works in that world, right? Like they're drenched, is that the word? They're saturated in that sort of old-timey bluegrass, pre-rock and rock and roll, I guess. Those musical genres, and also they live that kind of lifestyle, that psychedelic, touring constantly, Americana lifestyle. Like their music and their lives are so interwoven with American culture, and American culture is so interwoven with their music that for an outsider like me, an outsider who loves a lot of American art and a lot of art and music that is influenced by America, right? They just occupy this like unique space that is just like pure Americana, and it's really quite expansive in a way. Like they're not jazzy. Okay, so I hear a lot of people say that a lot of their fans say like, oh, listen to this gig or this specific performance. They get really jazzy here, but they're not. They don't really get that jazzy. I think that's silly. They get like a little bit jazzy, but then they were never jazz musicians. But my point here is that they do take little bits and pieces at the very least from all kinds of like American cultures, as well as like some European like folk kind of things as well. But it's just so pure Americana. And they are the OG like psychedelic band. I did do a video a while ago on like what is psychedelia, and obviously the Grateful Dead are really important to that. And their relationship with psychedelia has always been so interesting to me because if you put on like American Beauty or Anthem of the Sun, it is psychedelic music almost definitionally, right? But it's not obviously psychedelic to, again, I guess me, who was born in 1990 and grew up listening to a lot of the Beatles and I don't know, Small Faces or Beach Boys or a certain type of psychedelia, which is built much more on kind of wacky sounds in many instances, or like strange studio trickery and things like that. But you don't really get much of that at all, especially on the studio stuff from the Grateful Dead. Even live, the psychedelia comes more from this kind of like hypnotic jam, kind of expansive exploratory approach, rather than anything particularly, I guess, flamboyant or wacky, which is kind of the psychedelia I was used to when I first heard them. I remember just being like, this is, again, it doesn't really match the artwork, which is in many instances quite often like quite psychedelic. Doesn't match my expectations of what psychedelia should be. But obviously it is like they are the original really psychedelic band. Kind of if you go back to their history as a band and how they got together and their first performances, and yeah, they're more properly psychedelic than the Beatles, but they're not obviously so to most people. What am I getting at here? I'm kind of just this is completely unscripted. Usually I do scripted videos, but I'm kind of moving away from that a little bit and just talking a little bit more impromptu, and seeing how that goes. But yeah, I just want to kind of, it was just on my mind, this conversation I had recently, like who the Grateful Dead are as a band, what their identity is, and how that is perceived by someone like me, a complete outsider, as someone who does like them and you know would like to get more people into them, but also acknowledges the difficulty with that. It's not straightforward. They're not a straightforward band, and I think a lot of it comes down to some of the things I kind of hinted at before, and something I think maybe I'll close on. I'll keep this a short video, right? Let's zoom out a second. I'll make a big general statement that hopefully isn't too disagreeable. I think I'm correct on this, so bear with me. Like every time a new generation of artists, and in this case we're talking musicians, comes up, right? So in this situation we're talking about like 60s bands, the musician post-war babies, the baby boomer band, the first kind of big wave of baby boomer bands. So in the UK we're talking the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, etc. In America, well, there's loads of them. Obviously, everyone from Bob Dylan to Stevie Wonder to the Grateful Dead, Neil Young, he's Canadian, whatever. There's loads of them, right? But every time you get this big generation come up, there's kind of a narrowing and a culling of the previous generation's music, right? So fact, maybe the greatest culling in history was that baby boomer generation. Maybe it's not as obvious. This kind of I know more about that kind of stuff. So maybe it didn't happen as much. No, from what I know, it did happen. You know, it happened from romanticism, classicism into romanticism, and baroque into classicism, and all this kind of stuff. It happens, right? So there's this great culling of musical like styles and vocabularies and genres into the next one. So when a lot of pre-rock stuff, and there's loads, right? Everything from bluegrass, country, blues, doo-wop, like vocal jazz, folk music. There's all these genres, right? As they kind of pass on to the next generation, and that next generation, in this case, the baby boomers, takes all these influences and turns into something new. That generation creates loads of new stuff and new styles and new genres and new musical vocabulary, blah 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 blah. But also there is this like great culling where only certain things are passed on, and in many ways there was a massive simplification from pre-rock into rock music. A lot of people think that like rock music is more sophisticated blues, to take one example, but in many ways, actually in most ways, it's a massive simplification of blues music, right? And what am I getting at here? Right? How is this appropriate to the Grateful Dead? Well, the Grateful Dead are kind of one of the few continuations of a lot of genres and styles that were actually culled by that generation. And the Grateful Dead are one of the few that really kind of continued it on. And now, in many ways, like Bob Dylan or Neil Young and a few other artists like that, and a bit later on, I guess, half a decade or so later on, Bruce Springsteen, you know, had a lot of these influences, but none of them really leaned on or worked in those styles as much as the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead were really, in many ways, like an evolutionary throwback in a way, right? Because these old timey Americana traditional music and folk songs and styles really lived on in everything that the Grateful Dead did. And sure, they changed it and electrified it in many ways, and you know they have that huge psychedelic influence, and they brought other things in, but they really were, Jerry Garcia in particular, like huge catalogers of this kind of many pre-rock styles that didn't really live on into the next generation, into the kind of, I guess, well, Bruce Springsteen's kind of the next mini generation within that boomer generation, right? You're the original boomers who kind of born in the 40s, and then the 50s kind of children come up. Thin Lizzy in the UK are one of them, right? And in a way, there's even more narrowing of the previous genres as you get into them, because they kind of grew up a little bit more on that first baby boomer generation. So narrowed and then narrowed again. I hope I'm being clear here. I think I am. But the point is, Grateful Dead are in many ways like the Beach Boys in this sense, because the Beach Boys took a lot of like the vocal jazz and doo-wop influences, and most of that died out, and it was deeply uncool by the time you get to the late 60s, right? But the Beach Boys kept doing it, and they still kind of worked in that style with that musical vocabulary and those kind of aesthetics, right? And they just look deeply uncool and weird by the time you get to like 1967. The Grateful Dead never looked quite as weird and uncool, I don't think, as the Beach Boys did by that point. But they were still in a kind of pretty unique position of being a continuation of a bunch of styles and genres that did not really live on to the next generation, because the biggest bands of the day, again, Pink Floyd, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, a lot of these British bands, they really primarily took forward the blues thing. It wasn't just blues, there's a few other things going on, right? But it's a lot of blues, and they really ratcheted up the blues and, you know, distorted and put the volume up on that to a large degree, right? That's the biggest thread going through those biggest bands of the day. So this kind of more broad Americana, stylistic exploration that you see in Grateful Dead just didn't live on with anyone else really. And that's kind of what I was saying before about, do the Grateful Dead belong on that pantheon of great rock bands alongside all those other names I mentioned? In a way, absolutely. You know, I think they're a little bit harder. Their quality and their brilliance is a bit harder to spot. Um, Partly just because the way they wrote songs and the way they kind of had they prioritized their live concerts, and that's really what the experience was about. But also partly because they owe so much to other genres that just didn't really live on in anyone else for the most part, other than the Grateful Dead. Like maybe bits and pieces here and Bob Dylan and a few other artists, but really Bob Dylan was starting to sound very different by the time you get to the late '60s. Whereas the Grateful Dead really were always bringing through those other pre-rock and roll kind of pre-rock styles. So in a way, yeah, the Grateful Dead do belong on that pantheon, but in a way, they're just materially different. We think of them as this like big rock band. They're not really a rock band, not in the same way that all those other mastodonic, huge rock bands of the time were rock bands. There's a very different thing. The kind of the British experience of American music. That's really what rock music is. By the time you get to like the Who, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, etc., rock music as a British thing was like a reflection of American culture back onto America by British bands. Whereas the Grateful Dead, they were brought up, they were in it, they were American. It's not a reflection back to America from the outside, but they did kind of bring forward those other Americana pre-rock styles forward, and therefore they're just totally different. They're just very different to the other rock bands of the day. No one really ends up sounding like them, and that's a good thing. And and it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing and a slightly difficult thing because back to what I said at the start, right? Oh, do they write really catchy songs that anyone can just put on the radio and immediately love? And it's like, well, not really. I don't know. I don't think that's really their strength. Okay, well, what about the singing? Have they got like great vocalists who really stand out for just like sheer charisma or whatever? It's like, no, not really. That's not their thing. They're not really like super flashy virtuosic guitar players. They don't write these stonking great riffs. Yeah, it's kind of. Do you know what I mean? Maybe some people will probably disagree with me. They'll probably say actually they do all those things really well, but I think we need to be realistic about who they are as a band. Maybe I'll be a little bit disagreeable here and just say some people, as every band has this, right? Some fans definitely overrate them. Because I know that some people will be disagreeing with what I'm saying, that they are super virtuosic. And actually, Jacob, they do really sophisticated takes on jazz. And they just don't. Categorically, they just don't. They're not super virtuosic. They can dig in a little bit, but they're not shredders at all. They don't write these stonking great riffs. They're pretty poor singers. It works. I like their vocals, but they're not great. They're not strong vocalists. The lyrics are fine, but come on, they're not the best vocalists in the world. They just have this culture all by themselves for the reasons I tried to explain before, but probably did a really poor job at explaining. I kind of want to close here, but I just had one more thing to say, which is about their debut. This is the first album I ever heard by them. I went to my local library up in Carlisle, Cumbria, so a long way away from San Francisco, right? When I was like 14 or something like that. And at the local library, you could pay like 50p or something like that back in 2004 for an album. We'd rent it for like a week. That's how long you had it, and then we'd take it home and just copy it. And they had the Grateful Dead debut album. I think they had like a massive box set as well. I think that was all they had for the Grateful Dead. And I wasn't going to take the massive box set. I just took the little album. And I really liked it. And to this day, I think it's really good. A lot of Grateful Dead fans will say actually it's not a proper Grateful Dead album. The Grateful Dead themselves didn't seem to be that keen on it. But I think it's a really good album. I don't see what the problem is with it. It is totally different from their other stuff, and I can see how it doesn't match the Grateful Dead general experience and aesthetic of their live shows. And I can see how the band themselves might have been disappointed with that album for not capturing their live sound. But it's one of the best garage rock albums of the 60s. Whether it's like a proper representation of who the Grateful Dead were at that point or at all, I don't really care. It's just a good album and it has some solid songwriting on. The solos are nice, they work. I say I say it's a garage rock album, but it's not that sloppy for garage rock, and it's quite well recorded for garage rock. It just has that kind of overall garage rock psychedelic sound. It's not quite that. It is a bit less shitty than a lot of garage rock. A lot of garage rock in the 60s is good, but a lot of it has that kind of more lo-fi sound, and this doesn't quite have that. The album cover is completely bonkers. To this day, I can look at it and have no idea what the hell is going on. Maybe I need some chemical enlightenment to help me along with that. I don't know. I just don't understand what's going on. I get it a bit. It's not completely insane. Bit weird though. Don't know where the idea. Well, I do know where the idea for that came. Clearly LSD or mescaline or something. But it's a good album. It really is a good album. But like so many fans will shoot themselves in the foot by just being like, it's not very good. It's not great. It doesn't really represent them very well. Who cares? It is good. It's actually got some really good songs on it. Anyway, beyond that, Europe 72. That's a good album. I think it's Volume 1, is it? Or is it like an anniversary edition? There's one that kind of, again, this is where it's this even something as specific as Europe 72. There's all like volumes 1, 2, 3, 4. I swear there's like 20 of them or something. It's hard to get to the bottom and just find like a nice straightforward one to listen to. But their classic album Live slash Dead, I think is really good as well. Like you could just start there if you've not listened to much of them. Start there, and I always really liked and to this day love the version of Saint Stephen on that album. I think is really good.
Underfoot the ground is patched with climbing arms of ivy.
Just yeah, it is chill, and it is not super high energy. And again, it's not as if their singing is super impressive, but everything just comes together. And this is what the Grateful Dead at their best can do. Everything just comes together in this just like moment on moments, and there are a few of them through this song, right? Saint Stephen on Live slash Dead specifically. There's these few moments through it where just the music just seems to coalesce, and I don't know, it's almost like this moment of clarity in the music where everything just comes together. And again, like I said before, it's that Abe Simpson thing from The Simpsons. It's just like a place I've never been. I'm reminded of this place. Um, like how is that possible? I don't get it. There's not many other bands that can make me feel like that. Um, Actually, I'm not sure. I can't think of any other bands that make me feel like that. I can think of a few like visual or cinematic artistic things I've seen, like a certain moments in films, whatever, and I feel that kind of thing. But musically, just through pure music, there's not much that makes me feel that way, and that is totally unique. And that's really what you want from a band. I think a band is either going to be the best at something, like the Beatles were just the best at so many things, just writing great songs, right? Or I don't know, other musicians who were just the best at being this or that, or just completely unique, right? And if you're just completely unique, you don't even need to be the best in a way. You're just unique. You're in a category by yourself, and that's why I think they do deserve that place on the pantheon of classic rock. Again, problematic to even call them rock. They're a rock band in the kind of straightforward format of a rock band, but they're so different from everything else in rock that to call them that is almost misleading. Anyway, I'm at risk of just meandering and going off on one again, and I kind of want to stop it here. I do like the Grateful Dead. I dissed them a lot in this video, I know, but I do like them. If you don't know them well, maybe give them a listen. And if you do already know them well, and you think I'm an idiot for saying what I've said,